Good morning, good afternoon, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good day, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, the Nautical Institute's webinar on just culture. Our webinar today is one of the usual technical or usual webinars that the Nautical Institute do, and this one today is in regards to fostering a just culture, and to see if the maritime industry can indeed enhance safety, reduce fear of unjust prosecution, and ultimately protect lives at sea. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you guys today. As I said, we are the Nautical Institute, just in case anybody doesn't know who we are. We are an international professional body. We help members with professional development in education. We are a NGO, so we're a non-governmental organisation who has consultative status at the IMO, and we like to share information, inform best practice, and aid professionals to make the best decisions that they can. So just a quick few things about this webinar today. If you would like to ask us any questions, please feel free to do so. You can do that by clicking the questions button at the bottom or at the top of your screens. Your downloads and handouts that are available with this webinar can also be found at the top of the screen using the tiny icon at the top. And you can enable closed captions on this webinar by clicking the closed captions symbol at the bottom of the webinar. So thank you for joining us today. At the end of this webinar, you will receive a quick questionnaire, which will just ask you to tell us how we did today. After the webinar, you'll also receive a certificate to let you know that there are approximately 500 of you registered for this webinar today. So thank you all very much for coming. And if you need any news or further information on anything, you can find it on the Nautical Institute website. As I said, you can ask questions at any time by clicking the tiny questions button at the top. So I am your moderator today. My name is Somiyeh. I work for the Nautical Institute at the London headquarters, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel who are with me today. So our expert panel, who I'm going to actually ask for them to introduce themselves because they can obviously give you the best information about their own background. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Simon Daniels, who is a solicitor and maritime consultant. Over to you, Simon. We can't hear you, Simon.
Can you hear me?
We can now, yes.
I just got you to unmute me. Hello, everyone. Yes, Simon Daniels. Yes, I'm a practicing solicitor. I've been practicing virtually my entire career in criminal maritime law, and so I'm pretty well versed both in criminal negligence and in this new process of just culture. For some years, 10 years, I managed the law and business parts of the MCA course at Wasatch Maritime Academy. I'm now a consultant, as Somiyeh said. I'm principal lecturer at the Academy, and some of you may be aware that I've written a number of books actually on the maritime law side, and most recently just completed a book on just culture, which is appropriate.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Simon. Next up, I'd like to introduce David Hammond, who is a director of the Human Rights at Sea International. David, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, my good man?
Yes, thank you so much, and a real pleasure to be here. David Hammond, I'm actually a former military seafarer, been at sea, done it, and also former helicopter pilot. Currently a non-practicing English barrister, but best known for founding Human Rights at Sea, the charity, in 2013 and taking it to UN level of accreditation. Having moved on at the end of last year, I now lead, as Somiyeh correctly says, Human Rights at Sea International, and we're a socially focused human rights consultancy working from the UN through to state level and with a multitude of clients to really accelerate people's understanding of human rights protections at sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Stephen Jones, who, like Simon, is an author and has written a book for the Nautical Institute. But I'll hand over to Stephen Jones for him to introduce himself. Over to you.
Thank you, Somiyeh, and hello everyone. Great to be here. Stephen Jones, I'm a former seafarer from a long line of seafarers. I'm the founder of the Seafarers Happiness Index, so spend a lot of time dealing with the realities of life at sea and trying to understand them. So hopefully being able to plug those into the issue of just culture. As Somiyeh said, I'm an author for the Nautical Institute on maritime security. I'm also a member of the Northwest branch committee, so like to try and get involved and keep an eye on what's going on and engaging and seeing really the power of a professional body in trying to bring seafarers together to have that voice. And as Somiyeh said, setting out IMO, we have that voice and power to actually affect positive change. So I'm a practicing communications professional, and one day I hope to get good at it. But great to be here.
Amazing, thank you very much. So that is the panel introduced and myself introduced. So, gentlemen, I think we're just going to dive sort of right into the topic, because I think there's just a couple of slides I want to share first before we sort of delve into sort of more conversations or deeper conversations with yourselves. So when we did set up this webinar, and as you have, as people have registered, we did ask them about just culture, and we specifically asked them, what does just culture mean to every individual out there? And we got a vast and varied number of responses, and I'd just like to share a couple with you just so that we can sort of understand where people are coming from in the first place, and to really get to grips with the fact that there are so many different sort of understandings of the words just culture. And so it's interesting for us to be able to sort of discuss these, and I'd like to really start, get straight into it and sort of ask Simon and possibly David that if there is, such a varied understanding of the terminology of just culture in each individual industry, how do we make a common understanding? How do we create a standard or a commonality for people? I'll open it up.
Simon, that's such a good point. I mean, I can see the questions here tell me that there just isn't enough knowledge and understanding out there about just culture. It actually is a relatively new idea. It's just culture is one in which all employees are encouraged to provide and feel comfortable in providing safety-related information. It's an environment in which all employees understand that they will be treated justly and fairly on the basis of their actions rather than the outcome of those actions. Now, it may be, of course, that they have to accept that in certain cases a line must be drawn between what's acceptable and what's unacceptable behavior. The whole essence of just culture really is one of trust. It's got to deliver an atmosphere in which people are encouraged in providing safety information, which I was saying. And it started in civil aviation, and it has it has overspilled in recent years, thanks to the MAIB, actually. They've been really good at this. But however good it is, the very fact that everybody has got a different understanding of what just culture means must mean that the message isn't getting out there. We need to make it clear to people what this is all about, and that I think is going to, hopefully by the end of this webinar, people have a better idea.
And David, do you think you want to sort of add anything to that? Because from Sorry, excuse me. So from sort of a personal rights or a human rights perspective, if there was more just culture or a common understanding of just culture, do you think that could help people be better informed about their own rights and how to protect themselves and to protect other people?
In short, yes. Somiyeh, you've summarised the next hour. So thank you. And I fully concur with what Simon said there. I mean, Simon's word of trust is really important. But if we put it to what I call a plain English test, it may be better framed or could be framed as simply treating others as you would wish to be treated yourself, as a headline. Now, the first question that I actually think we should be asking, and the panel's had sort of various discussions by email on this, but it's a question I raised of actually, can a just culture genuinely exist in the current maritime industry with its structure, its complexity, its fragmentation, and the interests which are being represented across the entire supply and value chain? If the answer is yes, really we should ask a following question. If that is the case, how and through what enforcement mechanisms can it be applied? And I'm sure we'll unpack that later. But just to cover off what, and not to repeat what Simon was saying, but if you look at just culture, as Simon's correctly said, is well established in the aviation industry, and I speak as a former helicopter pilot frontline, which you certainly in the military would do some kind of or flying and go to limits which you wouldn't see in civil aviation. That need for a just culture was absolutely embedded from the outset. So it starts with first recruitment and training. But we also see it in the UK in the National Health Service, where that's about supporting consistent, constructive and fair evaluation of the actions of the staff. And also when we're looking from the aviation side, it's that continuous learning from previous mistakes and the encouragement, particularly in aviation, for pilots and ground crew to be able to open and freely share those essential safety related pieces of information. So those lessons identified and lessons learned can be shared. But I will, just before I finish, I'll just circle right back to that first question, looking at the complexity of the current maritime industry with all of the abuses, abandonment, etc., and the issues of suicide at sea, and ask that question. Can a just culture genuinely exist in the maritime industry today? Thank you.
Oh, and I think it leads quite nicely into something I'm going to sort of direct at Stephen, and that is sort of as a former seafarer, and as somebody who has been on board, how can even sort of a ship owner or a crew management company or HR specialist or just anybody within a shipping company, how can they ensure that there is almost a just culture on board for those seafarers? And and have you had any personal experience where just has been quite apparent or not, or quite the other way in a negative sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally agreeing with those issues, and the danger is in having such a widely kind of applied concept. It's very difficult. I guess in some ways it's the evidence of experience over definitions, and we have to ask ourselves, if we can't prove that a just culture exists, then we have to work under the assumptions that there's an unjust one. And I think from my experiences, certainly those feeding through from the Seafarers Happiness Index totally paint a picture of a situation that you would have to call unjust. The risks that seafarers are taking, issues of, David touched upon, abandonment, the problems with wages, non-payment of recruitment fees being charged illegally, the unfortunate foundations on so much of the operations of the shipping industry. And I just think we do have to tackle those absolutely fundamentals of the way we operate to have any chance of a just culture. And I think the point that's made there, whatever happens, that you can all move on I think is such an important, powerful point, whether that's physically, mentally, emotionally, that whatever goes on at sea, and it's a difficult job being a seafarer, it's a difficult industry. There's so many pressure points and problems that can arise that unless we can deal with them and then all move on, then we will struggle to have a just culture.
And I think that's why I think we've just sort of put this slide in there for everybody just to have a moment to understand that, you know, just culture is a notion that highlights that mistakes are, you know, defective organizational cultures rather than necessarily a single person's actions. And, you know, you figure out why mistakes were made as rather than sort of asking who created that problem. And I think that leads us, or will lead us quite nicely into sort of our next moment. So just give me 1 second while I stop sharing my screen. All right, excellent. So thank you so much for that, because I think it's really important for us to sort of highlight what people think just culture is before we sort of delve into any notions of accountability, just culture, and or any of those things. And as you've all highlighted, the maritime industry, or the difference between being on board and being ashore, there are so many different complexities to the industry. And as a general, I think if we're going to talk about seafarers, the one that holds the most sort of discretion or power in a situation is the master on board, the captain. He holds a unique and critical position, if anything. And I think the role in itself involves making crucial decisions that affect safety and operations of a ship. And they must, in some ways, balance that authority with accountability to show that their best actions, to not only show, but to also ensure that their actions are in the best interest of the crew. And as we've seen recently, there has been a trend towards criminalising negligence in incidents. And in the current sort of legal landscape, the master's decisions are subject to far greater scrutiny than they were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And we almost expect the masters of the industry or the captains of the industry to navigate these complexities of sort of even corporate accountability and like shifting responsibilities amongst crew and all that kind of stuff. So, and I want to ask sort of Simon and David, since, you know, you are in that sort of field of law and legal understanding, and you understand sort of recent legal trends. I think, Simon, if you could sort of give us, as we are trending towards criminalisation of the mariner, can you know, what are the implications for our maritime professionals?
Absolutely. Well, criminalisation wasn't really an issue before the problems involving environmental spills, and it only got generated, in fact, out of the Exxon Valdez case, when Exxon were extremely hasty in putting the blame for criminal negligence on poor old Joe Hazelwood, the master. And the prosecuting authorities believed him. And so they put him on trial. I believe it or not, he was found not guilty. But even so, hey, that started the trend. It started going from there. We've had cases which have not entirely, but largely involved environmental spills, where you had the issues in which, for instance, you had Captain Mangouras of the Prestige, where the vessel broke up, or she was in danger of breaking up. Both the master and the salvage master agreed that they need to take it to a place of safety, and the nearest one was in Spain. And the Spanish authorities said, "Oh, you're not taking that thing in here, and take her away." And in fact, they were forced to take her away, actually at gunpoint, and she subsequently broke up at sea. But the pollution still hit the shores of Spain, and Captain Mangoras was put on trial for criminal negligence. And to begin with, they had their trial, and he was found not guilty. Outraged, the prosecuting authorities appealed, and by a happy quirk of fate for them, he was found guilty on appeal. But you can see that the trend is developing. Why was that important? Is because in an environmental spill, if nobody's at fault, so if nobody's criminally negligent, then the most that the innocent parties are going to get is something out of the Oil Pollution Compensation Fund. Whereas if you can show that the master was criminally negligent, then there is no cap. Whatever the court determines is the amount, then that's going to be the case. And in Captain Mangoras' case, there was enormous outcry because this is absolutely true. At a preliminary hearing, he applied for bail, and the court said, "Yeah, we'll give you bail, 3 million euros." Of course, it was an outrageous sum, and it went right up to the European Court because, of course, it was a breach of the individual master's human rights. And the European Court said, "I hear what you say," but the trend now is that society wants somebody to pay, and so it's only right that this guy is held in custody. So you see the way that's developing. I just had a case. Well, I wish I could tell you about it because it's a great case. For obvious reasons, I can't disclose information about it. In which a cargo vessel was detained on not for a pollution event, but for the quantity of drugs, illegal drugs found on board. And so they thought, hey, this is a great idea, let's put the master on trial. They weren't terribly sure about their evidence, but they nevertheless they went ahead, but because they weren't entirely sure, they only made a provisional charge, for which that only gave them the right to hold the individual in custody. Well, after I think it was 2 years, that had to be replaced by a permanent charge, not a provisional charge, an indictable charge. And the prosecution failed to do so. And so the court, very rightly, threw the case out. And we told the master to get on literally the next flight back to his homeland. Don't even bother going back to the hotel. But of course, it meant that we got another example here of how the state wants to actually get a conviction.
And David, do you sort of agree in your sort of, with HRAS across sort of over the years? Do you find that there has become sort of a more trend of there being sort of a criminal situation or a criminal threat almost to masters on board or the captains?
In short, yes. I'll leave Simon to cover off the detail of all the cases. What I'll do is I will just focus, as you say, on those trends. It was raised by Stephen, that issue of unjust culture, and that we have seen as evidence from issues of blame, of litigation, of liability, and as Simon was saying, the need to hold people accountable, which is counterintuitive if you want to have a just culture. But to expand on that, we're actually, again, if we go back to the aviation world, we're looking at managing three core behaviours. The first is human error. We're all human and we can make mistakes. We do make mistakes. The issue is whether or not there's a culture to learn from that mistake and spread that knowledge. We then have the second management of behaviour, which is what we would call the at-risk behaviour. So that is commensurate with the job that you're doing, and that's why we have risk mitigation measures. It's the basis of evidencing the advisories for the likes of the marine insurance, for loss prevention. And that's accepted risk, which of course we then have professionalisation and training to address. And then finally, we've got the reckless behaviour. Now, what we haven't yet discussed is the cases whereby, unless you are a prosecutor or a defender or defence counsel, you're never going to see the full detail of what happened. But if you have reckless or unlawful behaviour, that also needs to be managed. And of course, if that's criminal, then that has to be dealt with on a criminal basis. So effectively, when we are looking at trends, to answer your question, Somiyeh, that unjust culture is definitely one that we've seen over the last decade. It's become to the forefront because of media, social media, and it's a balance of managing those three behaviours. I've got some other points, but I'll come back to you.
All right, excellent. And also, what I wanted to do in this, and sort of Simon's has naturally started to do this, is to draw some attention to some sort of real life cases, because I think without you looking at what sort of an unjust situation looks like in reality, do you actually understand how much or how wide that effect can be for so many different things. And I think the most prevalent or recent one, and is mainly probably because I've been in Croatia over the last couple of months, but I think with this the most recent one with Captain Marco and his first officer being jailed just for 30 years in Turkey. And, for me, 8 of the other members on board were acquitted. They were sent off because they had no connection to those drugs, but the authorities emphasized the command responsibilities of those 2 individuals, and consequently that's why they gave that such a severe sentence. And I think in this sense I would like to go back to David in this sense, just to understand about sort of your human rights and the concept of command responsibility, and what precedent does this specific case set for ones in the future? I mean, the man didn't have any idea that the drugs were on board, apparently. Just
Well, thank you. You raise a number of points here, and as a former criminal prosecutor, the evidence that actually gets adduced within the case versus the evidence that's available are often 2 different things. And very few people, as I highlighted, actually truly get to understand the full weighting of the evidence and the considerations within the jurisdiction. Of course, we have the judicial the judicial précis and the case reporting. So I can't make any specific comments in terms of the findings, but in terms of the precedents it's setting, it's an interesting one, because you look from a human rights perspective. Some people look at human rights, individuals, advocates, lawyers, as just banging the drum, very left wing. But actually, the real art of human rights protections and labour rights protections is being able to take a balanced view. And part of that balanced view is about upholding the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is not perfect. Law and justice are often 2 different things, and I'm sure Simon would agree with that from his vast experience. But the reality here is that we need to have some form of deterrent effect. Now, assuming that the cases that we're talking about have been conducted properly with the correct evidence deduced, the decisions and the findings of the court, whilst unpalatable for the victims, those who are found guilty or those who are not found guilty, actually is about setting the precedent for upholding the wider rule of law, because without it we have impunity. And what I just wanted to, and I sort of highlighted earlier of that sort of expansion of my points, was that there must, not should, the word is must, there must be transparency, accountability, that enforcement, and then the effective remediation for the victims, survivors, and also the families, the dependents. And that underpins and is involved with, linked to the international rule of law throughout the whole maritime industry, and of course associated supply and value chains. But we don't have that transparency, accountability, enforcement, effective remediation as a de facto approach. We have criminalisation, we have human and labour rights abuses that Simon's and Stephen have touched on towards the crew. We've got exploitation of crew, we've got organised crime, sanctioned state, we've got ghost fleets, dark fleets, arms trafficking. And what this means is that we have impunity for abusers in the very system that those crew are caught up into. And that will continue unchecked. And just culture will be an aspiration until we are able to provide a de facto approach of transparency, accountability, and enforcement. And then to finish off, and then back to you, in relation to the findings of these cases, of course, when you look at the common law precedent and the development of common law, but equally with arbitrated settlements, what we're actually seeing here is the development of accountability. That second word I used after transparency. And at the end of the day, the accountability comes down to the person who is in the chair, as equally as when you're a pilot, you are accountable for everything that you do whilst your hands on those controls, speaking on 3 different radios and moving passengers from A to B. I suppose the defence for that and the support for those professionals is rigorous training, professionalisation at the highest standards. But at the end of the day, it goes with a job. You have to be accountable for what you're doing, the people you're in charge of, and the cargo you're carrying.
And I think that's when I want to go sort of over to Stephen, because as a former seafarer and a sort of understanding, you know, like David said, the responsibility, the accountability, the authority that the master has, and in this sort of situation, it begs for us to sort of question the human factor behind it, and how that person's entire life is going to change from this moment where, in some respects had no idea what was going on. And I understand, as David said, that it's part of the job, but from a human sort of perspective, what are your views?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, the issue of accountability and making sure that it flows at all parts of the chain. And I think, appreciation of the reality that surrounds the role of seafarer, and particularly master, and the relationships with owners, and understanding, almost to an extent, an element of kind of personal risk management, of understanding the implications of those things. And it was interesting, I saw last week that the Nautical Institute president, Captain Trevor Bailey, actually ended a presentation on governance with the quote from Joseph Conrad that says, "I've known the sea too long to believe in its respect for decency." And I think in some ways that does capture the realities that face seafarers are very, very challenging and difficult. And you mentioned earlier, Somiyeh, the fact that we were often criminalising negligence. I think in often ways it's even before that point, it's criminalising presence. The fact that a seafarer is physically in a position to be held, those things, the parts of the chain that flow up and down, is really important. And I think understanding the relationship between seafarer as a convenient enemy of the owner and the state, even if things go wrong, is a really important, powerful situation, and one that seafarers need to possibly be better aware of.
And I think sometimes in a lot of these cases, awareness is key, and understanding and knowing and having that knowledge is sort of key. And that's when I want to sort of switch over to Simon to sort of understand that, is this, and I know it's not, but I was going to ask, is this a one-off? Or, you know, is this in this case, as I said, where Captain Marco and his first officer are going to prison? Is this a one-off? Are we developing accountability, or are we just on the wave of a trend?
What's really interesting, Somiyeh, is that there was a previous case very much like this in 2008. Captain Lactallo of a reefer called the Coral Sea, they were sailing from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean. During the course of the voyage, the charterers instructed them to actually go to another port. It's a port of Ion in Greece. So, you know, they had no idea about that at the beginning. And they actually discharged the pallets of the bananas on the dockside. It's waiting there. They are waiting for the pilot. When somebody noticed some suspicious packages inside the pallets on the dockside, and the master comes down, he gets arrested. Captain Lactallo actually gets arrested. He knew nothing about it, but he was prosecuted, and the prosecution said, we don't care whether you knew anything about it or not. You are the master. You have absolute discretion. You have commanded this vessel. You must therefore be responsible. And the court believed him. They sent him to prison. Now, admittedly, he subsequently was released on appeal. The conviction was quashed. But in the meantime, of course, he was stuck in a jail in Greece. So he was then released. Actually, he wasn't really, because by the time he came out of prison, because he was a non-EU national, his visa had expired, and so they put him back in prison for outstaying his welcome. But you can see that, you know, that as I say, that was 2008. These cases are just carrying on today. And the truth of the matter is, hey, in prosecuting authorities, they are under pressure to meet the public perception of finding someone to blame, and that's what they do.
So we are
Sorry,
quickly running out of. Oh,
sorry,
go on, David.
I have to jump in there just to, forgive me, but for clarification. Simon's correct in terms of failures of justice in jurisdictions. Not all jurisdictions are up to the standards, we would say, and it's not perfect, of the UK and other states. And it also goes to the quality of the lawyers and their training and their experience. But just to be clear, from an English perspective, a prosecution will not occur unless there is a realistic prospect of conviction. And that goes through a tiered level of review. So just not to undermine what Simon has said, but from a clarification from English law perspective, and that is really critical because it's protecting the human rights of the right to liberty. Because, of course, that fundamental human right of your individual right to liberty is one that can be taken away by the state and state authorities if you have conducted yourself in a criminal manner. Thank you. Sorry for butting in. I just want to make it clear for the international audience. Thank you.
Can I butt in after that? Because David and I could have a fascinating conversation for hours and hours and hours, and we've only got about 20 minutes left. Because the question in just culture is, you know, do we trust this system? You know, it has to be said that who makes the decision to prosecute? It's actually in our case, it's someone from the Crown Prosecution Service. In other countries, they will have other prosecuting authorities, but it's some prosecutor who gets to draw the line between what is acceptable behavior in terms of criminal activity and what is unacceptable behavior. Now, in this country, and this is where David and I can have a lively conversation. The lawyers in the CPS, in the Crown Prosecution Service, don't have domain expertise. So, how do they get to? They have to draw the line. It's their decision. And I have to say, so many cases have ended up with the defendant actually being acquitted. It demonstrates the fact that, yeah, even us in this country, we don't have a perfect system, but all the stress, all the mental torture that a master goes through in being prosecuted doesn't get wiped out. They don't get compensation.
And I think that's sort of where I was going to head towards, to sort of understand, as we do head into the Q&A sessions, for what some people have put onto the Q&A. But we do, our seafarers do, shipmasters do face increasing legal liabilities. So many complex and modern operations that they've got to go through. Sort of supportive measures, including legal protection, mental health resources. Those things I think are almost essential to navigate these challenges for people, especially in such a fast-paced environment with technology. And yesterday I had an interesting conversation. I touched upon techno stress and what that sort of looked like. So I think promoting a safe working culture involves not only continuous education, transparent communication, commitment from everybody to ensure that everybody's well-being is catered for as part of that change. And so I think the link between the consequence of legal action, criminalisation, and stress and anxiety is clear. And I think, Stephen, as a former seafarer, have you ever been in a situation where there is, even the concept or the threat of sort of legal action, criminalisation, or any of those things has had a negative impact on the state that you are, your human self?
Yeah, I mean, I think just coming back to the point there, about trust being key in all of this, the concept of, as David said, the difference between law and justice that often pervades. And I think, again, from a seafarer's perspective, setting out on that journey over the horizon, again, quite a task to perform. But you need to have that. So a just culture isn't just about the absence of fear. It's also about the presence of trust, about having the ability to know that you won't be scapegoated or blamed when things go wrong. And I think, unfortunately, that's not so much the case, and particularly so with social media. The lies, the slander, the libel, the problem around any incident can make it almost toxic before anyone has ever even come close to court, etc. So it's extremely challenging for any seafarer anywhere to be, in the face of that. And when things go wrong, then, it's very difficult to see where the just aspects kick in.
And do you think, as just to ask you from a more personal perspective, sort of, even when you were at sea and sort of going through your career, did you understand your indemnity insurance? Did you understand your rights or how to access your legal representation if anything was to happen? Did you know how to get those things, or do we think we're at a stage where we need to educate people better about, their own personal security in that kind of situation?
We definitely need to educate and prepare seafarers better across all different ways, and whether it's access to, the welfare support, legal support, their actual situation and position. An expectation that a P&I club will pick up the tab, well, they won't, because you're not the ship. So understanding your role in the actual situation and the reality of it, of who are the cavalry that are going to charge over the horizon to rescue you when things go wrong. I don't think we have sufficient grounding, possibly at a at the most important parts of a career to really honestly prepare for these things. And in some ways that's obvious, that you go to embark on your career thinking about the good things, not necessarily all the bad things. And we have enough of a problem with recruitment and retention as it is. So we don't want to necessarily paint too bleak a picture, but we have to create an honest landscape that seafarers operate in. And I think, again, it goes doubly. I've talked a lot in the recent kind of couple of years about sustainability. Now, we're talking constantly about the environment, but the social and the governance aspects of ESG are hugely overlooked in all of this. And the situation that seafarers can find themselves within a wider unjust culture mean that we are fundamentally unsustainable when it comes to the way that we treat seafarers. And I think it does need to be a part of the wider debate.
And David, do you find that, having human rights at sea and trying to sort of build a bit more awareness and build sort of, a bit more education and knowledge in that sort of field, do you find people are almost clueless? I don't know if that's the right term to use.
They're not clueless. They're just not aware because the material is not there. So I loved Stephen's phrase there, the cavalry charging over the hill. For a decade, we felt very much like that from civil society, because we would have cases coming to us that hadn't gone through the usual system, that had dropped through the cracks. And we always felt that Human Rights Sea as a charity, as it stood up, was the final catch-all when it had fallen through every other safeguard. But civil society does have an important, responsible civil society does have an important part to play. And we issued over 95 publications within the resources still on the Human Rights Sea website. There is a huge amount of material and case studies. But what I also wanted to pick up on what Stephen was saying was this court of public opinion. The court of public opinion is dangerous. It's toxic. They are the judge and the jury, and professionally, amongst professionals, we'll have discussions. But how can you have discussions with people who are innately biased, have no understanding of the material, of the environment, but have a judgment and have following? So that is something Stephen and I, when we first started at sea, didn't have to deal with. And I'm sure Simon, when he started practicing, didn't have to deal with. And I wouldn't want to be in young seafarers' boots myself now.
All right, amazing. So we're going to go into some questions because we are only sort of 12 minutes before the end, and I want to be able to answer as many questions as possible. And so I'm going to, this is a bit of a legal one and perhaps maybe one more about in regards to advice, but we have had somebody who has said just culture in the aviation industry was introduced by regulations, not directive in EU regulations. Why is the shipping industry resistant to the just culture or to regulations around just culture? And I'll go with, I don't know, Simon first or David?
Essentially, just culture originally arose out of a convention called the Chicago Convention in 1944, and it's been working. There was a case last year in which it was so patently wrong that prosecuting authorities tend to ignore it, but it is actually covered under maritime conventions, and that's why the MAIB is one of the it's an organ of the UK flag state, like so many internationals, that have to follow the point that you have to start with a report, a technical investigation before you proceed with the prosecution. It just so happens that sovereign states, they want to hold on to their toys, and so they want to make sure that if they want to prosecute someone, they can, and so there is room there for prosecuting authorities to stop before anybody else. And there was a. I'm sure we're all aware of the container ship, the Dali. Immediately after the casualty took place, the Coast Guard naturally wanted to get on board the ship. They couldn't because the FBI got there first. They wanted to investigate this from a criminal point of view. And hey, that's it. That's a responsible state.
And I just, so, because we do have another question around sort of, I think, what you're talking about, and that is in regards to law and legal standing and support. I mean, if somebody does break the law or is negligent, just culture does not apply, or does it apply? Because, you know, and in terms...
Right, okay, that's a really good point, because it's such a grey area. The just culture is there in order to develop this concept of trust, so that people know that they can develop safety related information and without the fear of prosecution. The trouble is that, you know, back to what I said before, who gets to draw the line between what is otherwise blameless in the criminal sense and what should be prosecuted, and that's someone in the prosecutor's office who doesn't necessarily have any domain expertise whatsoever. And so I can't answer that question with a firm yes or no, because it's blurred, and that's one of my long-standing objections to this. I have a bit of a crusade about that.
So, David, do you want to sort of add anything?
Yes, I would agree with certainly agree with Simon when he talks about domain expertise. We're talking about the requirement within prosecuting authorities all around the world to have the access to really detailed understanding, and often you have to have been to sea to understand what it's like at sea within the context before you even apply the law. But what I wanted to add to what Simon said is that in general, I would say that we cannot assume that a just culture is automatically feasible against the background of the maritime industries and the bad players invariably failures, which continue today. And that's despite many best efforts across the likes of good owners, the clubs, and the unions, because we still have flags of convenience, criminalisation, abandonment. We've got the growing issue of dark fleets and what are happening there, and of course forced labour conditions. We've got to address that before we can even really be relying on saying, hey, we work within a just culture.
Okay, and I have one now. I've got one for Stephen. So, because I think this is sort of, I don't know, from your experience, and just to sort of encourage people or to understand why you would still report something. So, even with so much emphasis on the practice of just culture, seafarers are being blamed and criminalised, and this is on the rise. The fear within the seafarers at present is not sailing in war zone or high-risk areas, but for being criminalised for their job. How can we ensure seafarers feel comfortable reporting any incident or near misses?
That's the magic that has to happen. You know, that is the turning point that will have to hopefully come if we are to genuinely have a just culture, if we are going to be sustainable, if we are going to be all the things that we aspire to be and the drivers within the value chain rightly demand of us. Would I feel comfortable reporting certain things in certain places? No, probably not. And I think that's the reality of it. until we're at that position, then all of this, has to be just part of that conversation on moving us forward, and of, going back to the points that we made earlier, of developing that trust and the relationship between seafarers and the ships going into places. And I think one of the things that unfortunately has happened over the past kind of probably couple of decades is that in the relationship between society and shipping, of the value, the importance, and of what comes on. I think the COVID experience did bring shipping and seafarers back into the spotlight in a positive way as being key workers and doing the various important things that they do. But that seems to have evaporated a little bit again now. So until people in the wider sense understand what ships are doing, why they're there, what they're bringing, how it all operates, then it's going to be intensely difficult to not have this kind of scapegoating of seafarers when things go wrong.
Thank you so much. I was going to say, has anybody got anything to add to that, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen makes an absolutely vital point here, and that's how if you like, the trend in the maritime management environment has changed in the last few years. It's difficult to put a particular date on this, but probably back in the 1970s, when the pattern of shipping was changing so much that you had the old maritime families were bowing out, and you had very large organizations coming in, which are driven not by people with maritime experience, who maybe they've been at sea themselves, but by accountants. And so it's the bottom line which they're protecting. And we saw with the Exxon Valdez, the first thing which Exxon did was to say, "Oh, don't blame us. It was the master. He was a drunk." And within 24 hours of the Costa Concordia, you had Costa Cruzieri saying, "Oh, don't blame us. It was him, not us." You can understand how David and Stephen's points about trust is so important. And hey, if you can't trust your employer, you're on your own, sunshine.
All right, and all right, we got a couple minutes ago, and I just want to ask just one more question of David before I share the last few slides, for just to wrap it up. But I want to sort of, as you were talking about earlier, unjust culture, and Stephen brought it up, and David, you elaborated on it a bit more. But I want to know that will fostering a just culture alone be enough to transition away from blame culture? And as you have rightly highlighted, in the trials of social media that you have even before it gets past an investigation stage, everyone's got an opinion about something before that. And if not only that, but sometimes even that the blame culture is anticipated and sometimes even wanted by people to the concept of drama that's going on. And I just want to know that will fostering a just culture remove that blame culture aspect that we have in society?
Thank you. I try to be an optimist in everything that we do. You have to in our game. The answer to your question, short answer, is in the current generation, I don't believe so, because we are so set in our ways, the manipulation of media, social media, as I said, that cult of public opinion. But one thing I am seeing as I getting on in the years is the next generation. I've got a huge amount of faith in the next generation. The point here is that if we bring the just culture concept, it's endorsed at the likes with the ILO, the IMO within the maritime context, and we start with the framework, building on the work that the likes of Simon has done, and we set the standard, we start educating, then if it becomes the DNA of the next generation of not just seafarers, but everybody within the maritime supply and value chain, then de facto, it becomes a just culture. The example I will give is if I look at the next generation, the majority of the next generation I speak to about their views on environmentalism, to them, it's absolutely natural to be sustainable, to look at the environment, to care about the environment. Within our generation, we probably took it for granted because it was our generation that has caused many of the issues, arguably. But my point is, their DNA, right from the very start, is one of understanding that there are finite resources. So if we can transpose that education and that influence right at the outset, then I believe over a period, and it will be another generation, we can move towards a much greater and just culture.
All right, thank you so much, gentlemen. We are unfortunately out of time. I mean, we could continue this discussion, I think, for as long as we all shall live. But I thought I would just sort of end with a final sort of couple of screens, which is if you do want to learn more and educate yourself, please do sign up for our criminalisation of the mariner course. You can find this course by booking online. You can head over to the Nautical Institute Academy or scan the QR code. There are handouts with this. There are also 40% off our publications. If you want to take advantage of this, please head over to the publications team. You can quote the promo code and get some discounts on some publications to sort of expand your knowledge and just understand where you stand. And as ever, and finally, if you do want to join the Nautical Institute, if you are not a member, we do have branches all over the world and list our events and activities on our website. Please do head over or get in touch with us. We will be happy to help you or direct you in a position where you can get the help that you need. Thank you so much for joining us today. I say that is all we have got time for, but it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.